there's been so much time debating what a small state is that it would distract from questions about what small states do.
When and why do small states fail, and when and why do they succeed?
There's just not that much trade amongst countries in the region still. That's born out of a renewed view that the way the United States is going to exercise its hegemony in Latin America is through coercion.
Why do these organizations keep coexisting throughout time? Are they successful? Are they failing?
Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. But my question would, in a sense, be who's going to lead it and for what interests?
Welcome to the pilot episode of New Regional Orders, a podcast by the Center for Regional Integration. I'm the Center's founding director and your host, Ivo Ganchev. And on the show, I interview practitioners and academics with in-depth expertise and fascinating analysis of the ways that the economies, geographies, political trends, and other aspects of different regions intertwine to form regional politics, regionalism, and regional integration in different parts of the world. On the first season of the show, my guests and I will focus on exploring regionalism in the Americas. And on subsequent seasons, we'll do this in other regions of the world, such as Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, among others. My guest on this first episode of our podcast is Professor Tom Long from the University of Warwick. He's the author of two acclaimed books, including A Small State's Guide to Influence in World Politics, published by Oxford University Press, and Latin America Confronts the United States. The latter was recognized as one of the best books of 2016 by the prestigious magazine Foreign Affairs. And Tom is also the author of numerous state-of-the-art research articles which have appeared in top-tier journals in the fields of international relations, political science, and history, including the American Political Science Review, International Security, and International Organization. I learned a lot from this conversation with Tom and truly hope that his insights can reach a broader audience because they're worth considering and they can help us shape our understanding of what's happening in politics and regionalism in the Americas today, especially as the US is adjusting its foreign policy strategy. You know the drill. If you like the content that we produce, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting platform or simply on my YouTube channel where I upload the video versions of my conversations. Without further ado, let's roll the intro, get started, and I hope that you'll enjoy the show. Welcome to the show.
Ivo Ganchev, Beijing-based academic, executive, and consultant.
I wanted to try a new theory on you.
Mira, esa es una pregunta para un examen de grado.
Go to the communities and listen to people, and listen to people, and listen to people.
Exploring change across the borders. Welcome to New Regional Orders.
And it's my great pleasure to welcome today Professor Tom Long. Tom, welcome to the show, and many thanks for hosting us today at the beautiful University of Warwick.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to have this chance to talk with you.
Let's talk about your research. You've written broadly about Latin America and the role of small states in international politics. What motivated you to pursue this research in the first place, and how would you situate it within academia or even within the literature on politics? Who is your research for?
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to stop and reflect a little bit about your research trajectory because, of course, it's not necessarily what I had planned out when I was applying to do a PhD. When I started doing research out of an interest on Latin America and US relations with Latin America, one of the things that I noticed was that though there was a lot written about how the United States made its foreign policies, what the United States did in or to Latin America, there was much less attention to how Latin American actors responded. And in particular, there was less attention to the ways in which Latin American actors might actually try to influence the United States with greater or lesser degrees of success. So that started to drive my research on Latin American engagement with the United States. From there, I looked out to what other bodies of work in IR might connect with that, might have something to say about that. And I became very interested in the dynamics of power asymmetries, and in particular, the ways in which the relatively weaker actor in asymmetrical relationships might try to manage those asymmetries. That led me to research on small states. So I started to write some about small states kind of on their own, in their own right, and to make a case for why international relations theory needs to take small states much more seriously than it does.
You're one of the few scholars that have focused on small states, at least explicitly, even though there's a lot of literature, it doesn't necessarily use this term or associate itself with this term, small states in particular. Of course, there are some great works by Peter Katzenstein, by Jacqueline Braveboy Wagner, but there's not that many scholars that effectively brand their research as focused on small states. Let's delve into this topic a little bit.
Sure.
How do you define a small state, and how much agency, if any, do they actually have in international politics?
Well, there's been a long-standing debate about how to define a small state, and this is one of the questions on which I think actually work on small states in IR got kind of unnecessarily hung up. Sometimes it's been so much time debating what a small state is that it would distract from questions about what small states do, how they go about it, why they do what they do. There's been a bit of a boom in research on small states, but I think oftentimes it gets very much kind of peripheralized with international relations, or there's a more concentrated group of work on small states in Europe, within European institutions or on their own, but European small states. People like Anders Weivel at Copenhagen have a tremendous body of very influential work on this. In terms of how to define a small state, this is where I've moved a little bit, I think, in a different direction, which is that kind of coming back to my interest in asymmetry, disparities in power, that for me is basically the defining characteristic of a small state in international relations. It's about the relationships. So a small state is a state that is by far the weaker partner in a relationship. And then that's sort of easy to see in a bilateral relationship, but I think we can step back and kind of network that out into broader patterns of relationships and think about the way in which being over and over the relatively smaller actor in those relationships structures small states' identities, their interests, their patterns of opportunities and constraints.
Let's try to apply some concepts in practice. So, using your definition and your framework, which states in Latin America would be categorized as small? And we can think about Latin America as roughly from the Rio Grande to the Tierra del Fuego as a region. And how about the other states? So if these states, whichever they are small, what kinds of states are the others? Are they middle powers? Are they great powers, if there are any great powers in Latin America at all, according to you? And how do their sort of approaches and strategies to foreign policy differ? What are the implications of this?
Well, I think that this is one of the things that might frustrate people about my relational approach to defining small states, which is that a small state might be, or a state might be small in one context and not in others. So there are some states where smallness vis-a-vis another state is almost a defining attribute of how they engage with the world, how they see their position in the world. So if you look at states in Central America, states in the Caribbean, when their most salient relationship has long been with the United States, increasingly with China as well, but sometimes with Mexico, that makes them small in that context. Of course, when Central American states engage with one another in SICA, in previous regional integration bodies and structures, they don't necessarily see themselves as small vis-a-vis one another, but their context of smallness in a neighborhood where the United States is a dominant power still shapes how they're engaging in those patterns of regional integration. In South America, it's a bit different picture. You have a state like Bolivia that does often see itself as small, certainly vis-a-vis Brazil, which is sometimes more salient for Bolivia than the United States, but then secondarily, to the United States. You can find other cases, though, where this isn't so clear-cut. Chile has, if you go back to the 19th century, Chile acted as if it were a great power almost in parts of the 19th century. It expanded, it had a very kind of realist approach to foreign policy. But if you look at Chile today, Chile will adopt a posture of smallness on the global stage sometimes, and say, we're a small open economy, we have to play by the rules of the liberal international order because that's our position. But then, Chile within South America, vis-a-vis its immediate neighbors, doesn't necessarily define itself as a small state. So I think actually the way in which states politically engage often has attributes of this kind of relationalist definition as well.
When we think about small states, some of them are generally perceived as relatively successful, for example, like Uruguay, like Panama, which you've written about, and others are perceived to be almost, I dare say, failing states like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, for example. When and why do small states fail, and when and why do they succeed? And what are the optimal approaches that their governments should take to achieve their goals or optimize their strategy in international politics?
Well, I think if we're sort of some of those failings in a sense, or those weaknesses of state capacity, I don't know that they have so much to do with size, because of course you could find much larger countries that might have similar weaknesses in state capacity. There, they have the added difficulty perhaps of having to project that state capacity over a much bigger territory. And so, those kind of domestic reasons, there are some particularities of smallness, though I think this exists on a continuum. But I'm not entirely sure that they are really about size. They have much more to do with domestic institutional strength and the many variations that might shape domestic institutional strength. When we think about smallness, as I'm sort of saying, in international relationships, and how the relatively weaker partner in a relationship might go about pursuing its interests, getting at least some of what it wants, there I think we can actually start to identify commonalities across cases of relationships that are very hard to identify if we just sort of take states as the unit of analysis, right? So if we think about relationships, asymmetrical relationships as the units of analysis. And what I think we can identify is small states that are more successful kind of reading the panorama of constraints and opportunities, because small states don't get to set those constraints, right? To an extent, they have to deal with the world as they find it, or the relationship as they find it, at least in the near term. But within that, they can identify, is this an issue that is really salient for the great power that I'm dealing with? If not, does that give me some opportunities while the great power's not paying attention? Is this an area where we have a lot of divergence, or where maybe we can frame things in a more cooperative way, and that allows me to pursue some of what I want to pursue? So I think being able to identify those relational characteristics and pursue them is this really important feature of leadership for all states, but for small states, it's more salient. It's exacerbated by the patterns of asymmetry.
Let's stick to Latin America for a little bit. You've written about a potential resurgence of the Monroe Doctrine, which originally emerged in 1823 as something that aimed to prevent European interference in the Western Hemisphere, but it was later used for, to justify U.S. intervention in Latin America. Recently, the newly elected President Donald Trump evoked the concept of manifest destiny when he was outlining his vision for the U.S.'s role in the world, and the phrase America's backyard has been used consistently to describe Latin America from a U.S. perspective. How would you characterize the U.S.'s current view on Latin America? Do you see any continuity with past policies, or has Washington's approach fundamentally shifted in response perhaps to new global dynamics?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to discuss there. And there's a lot happening, of course, even as we have this conversation. You know, I was sitting in the audience at the Organization of American States when John Kerry, then Secretary of State, stood up and said the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. And that was an interesting thing. You know, Kerry got a lot of applause. This made the headlines in Latin American countries that were glad to see the United States taking this position. But the Monroe Doctrine has come and gone at different points in history. And the Monroe Doctrine has had many different meetings to many different audiences. So seeing this resurgence of the Monroe Doctrine, which we saw some of in Trump's first administration as well. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson have said the Monroe Doctrine is a great thing in response to questions that he got. So we saw some of this, but we're seeing it with a much greater degree of stridency. And as you said, kind of linking it to manifest destiny, linking it to expansionism. That harks back to the type of Monroe Doctrine that, as you said, is not about just excluding European powers or now China. This is also about asserting a certain type of paternalistic U.S. role, if not direct control in Latin America. And that's, I think, very concerning for countries in the region. You know, we're seeing this in Panama, where Secretary of State Rubio made that his first stop as Secretary of State. I mean, quite remarkable. And that's born out of a renewed view that the way the United States is going to exercise its hegemony in Latin America is through coercion. Or at least through the threat of coercion. Of course, there's a long history of that with the United States and Latin America. And it never entirely went away, but it certainly shifted to the back burner for a long time. You know, after the 1990s, the idea was that the United States would lead in Latin America through setting incentives, you know, tying access to its market to compliance with certain policies the U.S. favored. It would exercise some pressure at times. That never went away in the case of Cuba, of course. But on the whole, you know, coercion was going to take a back seat to other types of U.S. incentives. You know, this is raising a lot of concern in Latin America now, and we're seeing it through threats of tariffs. We're seeing it through threats to take back control of the Panama Canal. Things that hark back to earlier and, in my view, much darker days of U.S.-Latin America relations.
You've spoken about the mechanisms that the U.S. uses to influence Latin American politics, and the name of this show is New Regional Orders.
Right.
So I just have to ask you, how does this shape or influence regional politics in Latin America?
Yeah, you know, if you don't mind me going on a bit of a historical detour, you know, if we look back, Latin American regionalism has long had a couple of different currents. You know, there was a current that was defensive in a sense, or at least in part defensive, where Latin American countries responded to interventions from Europe in the 19th century, to US expansionism, by trying to band together. And in that type of a current, the shared republicanism of those countries, shared identity around having been former Spanish colonies. Brazil occupied a somewhat distinct role until it kind of transitioned away from monarchy in the end of the 19th century. So there's that kind of defensive current, and that has seen resurgences as well in response to U.S. pressures in particular. On the other hand, there's been a kind of a Pan-American current that seeks, yes, unity amongst Latin American states, but with the idea that part of the reason for that unity is cooperation with the United States on more favorable terms. So now, you know, what are we going to see? I mean, what patterns of regionalism might we see? There is concern, for sure, about the kind of resurgent interventionism from the United States, But my worry, in a sense, is that the perspectives in Latin America on what type of regionalism to follow are so diverse and so divided as a domestic political issue within different countries. I mean, Argentina and Brazil are on totally opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what type of regional strategy they would like to follow and why. That it's very difficult for either of those models or something new to predominate. So I think at the moment what we're seeing is this fragmenting of regional currents that makes it very hard for Latin America to either, one, and take a more defensive posture, or two, adopt a posture that would allow it to negotiate with the United States in terms of cooperation on more effective terms.
We've been discussing so far sort of an external influence on Latin America, which is, of course, US influence and the way that it shapes the decisions of Latin American leaders and their states. But you've also written about domestic factors that influence foreign policy in Latin America. Can you help us explain how do these domestic factors intermingle with the way that U.S. foreign policy influences Latin America and the leaders of Latin American countries? And you can perhaps use some examples to illustrate this better for our audience.
Sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, foreign policy is never made in isolation of domestic politics. And on the other end, domestic politics also respond to the structures that are created by international politics. So I think that, if you look at this from the outside in, from the international to the domestic, you can see, for example, the way that different economic structures. So whether countries tend to trade a lot and what they trade with the United States versus those that have moved more towards China, you then see coalitions within different Latin American countries that might be more supportive of one, kind of moving towards one or towards the other. And this can create some real problems for leaders who are ultimately kind of in the middle, right? So in terms of examples of this, Argentina's export economy had reoriented away from the United States and to an extent away from Brazil and towards exporting towards China, right? Soy, agricultural products in particular, perhaps moving into some mining, lithium, things like that. That had been relatively supportive of the left Peronist governments that had been in power, even though there were a lot of tensions between those governments and the soy producers. Ultimately, they had a shared interest in kind of maintaining commercial ties, expanding commercial ties with China. Now you have a president in Argentina who came into office saying he was going to, break all ties with China, and he's found himself deeply constrained by those domestic political coalitions. Right? Okay, shift to a different example. Look at countries that have traditionally been very dependent on the United States. Mexico exports 85% of its exports to the United States, and it doesn't just kind of export whole products like soy, like Argentina does. It's in an integrated manufacturing platform with the United States in all sorts of different sectors, and if supply chains, value chains, very closely interlinked. So what do when they're facing threats from the first Trump administration to tear up NAFTA, and now threats from the second Trump administration to slap them with unilateral tariffs? We've actually seen in the first Trump administration this cross-border mobilization of pro-North American interests to, one, push the Mexican government to be more accommodating, and two, to restrain the impulses of the first Trump administration. So what do we get? We get a renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement with some important modifications, but holding together the core aspects of North America as a regional project. Right? Now we're seeing a potentially different environment, a less constrained Trump administration, threatening unilateral tariffs, supposedly having to do with drug trafficking and not economic factors, though I think the rationales are not consistent. And we've seen a rallying of domestic forces behind a Mexican president who had strong support but also faced some very entrenched opposition from economic elites. This threat to North America has brought a lot of those economic elites on side behind the Mexican president Claudia Sheinbaum. So we can see this sort of playing out differently, but this is this intermingling of these international economic structures that closely connect with how coalitions form domestically and what their patterns of support are internationally and within their own domestic political game.
At the intersection of U.S. influence in Latin America and domestic factors that influence politics there, you see a sentiment of what the literature sometimes refers to as anti-Americanism. And we've seen many politicians tap into this and gather support for various incentives. We've seen, obviously, in Venezuela, from Chavez to Maduro now, the whole rhetoric that essentially demonizes the U.S. and its influence across South America as a whole. We've seen also, obviously, what's been happening in Cuba since Castro. We've seen recent surges in this type of sentiment in Bolivia, in Ecuador, during the pink tide with Rafael Correa's 21st Century Socialism, and with also various other surges in similar movements across particularly South America. How would you characterize this idea of anti-Americanism? How strong is this sentiment? Is this an intellectual idea, or is this something that simply emerges out of the context of the practice of politics in the region? And how does it affect regional politics across South America, Latin America, or perhaps the Americas as a whole?
Yeah, I should say, one of my PhD supervisors is the historian Max Paul Friedman, and Max wrote an excellent book called Rethinking Anti-Americanism. And one of his arguments in that book, which I find quite convincing, is that the idea of anti-Americanism is often quite convenient for U.S. political elites to mobilize, to discredit opposition that is not about Americanism, right? I mean, what is Americanism? Right? So there's an anti-Americanism, but it's not clear what the Americanism is. But it's opposition to concrete U.S. policies and actions. And so then it gets branded as anti-American as a way to say, well, this is just because they, in the words of George W. Bush, they hate our freedom, right? They hate us and something about us. In a way, that's easier to discredit actors for that than to say, well, actually, they really oppose these particular policies that we've been advancing. And I think that within Latin America, a lot of what gets talked about as anti-Americanism elsewhere, it gets talked about, at least on the Latin American left, as anti-imperialism. If you look at sort of Cuban language going back to the revolution, Cuba talks about anti-imperialism, and then the United States says, well, they're anti-American. So I think it's important to separate. Are there particular U.S. policies or models that are provoking this sort of a response of opposition from Latin America? Is it something about the structural position of the United States? I think asymmetry, kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, is really important because the United States, when it does something that to itself seems quite small, the reverberations of that policy for a small, highly interdependent state can be extreme. So small changes that the United States made in the sugar quota had massive ramifications for Cuba going back. Small changes that the United States made for entirely domestic purposes in its trade or economic policies could set off a recession in a Latin American country that was highly dependent on the United States. And the United States, as a very large country, as many very large countries tend to do, are not very aware of those ramifications of its actions. And that lack of awareness in this context of asymmetry provokes this strong response sometimes in Latin America. So, and to come back to the broader framework of your question, I think we've got to separate out what is opposition to particular U.S. policies. Are those policies that maybe need to be reconsidered if we wanted to have more productive, cooperative relationships, mutually beneficial relationships with our neighbors, U.S. neighbors in the Americas? Or is this something that is really just opposition to the United States? And I think most of the time, it might be because the United States is threatening to deport fellow citizens in military planes in shackles. That might provoke a response that then gets labeled as anti-American, but maybe the United States needs to think why that is.
Moving on from one ism to another, we spoke about Americanism and anti-Americanism, but you've also written about something that you refer to as Republican internationalism, which was prominent in the 19th century. Could you explain the origin of this concept and this term, and also for those in our audience that find historical processes in Latin America fascinating in general, what are some of the most important aspects of historical traditions related to Latin American politics that we need to know about in order to help explain the contemporary dynamics of politics in this region?
Yeah, so the idea of Republican internationalism is, in a sense, trying to explain the sources of Latin America's engagement and contributions, I think, to international order as we know it today. Normally, when we talk about the formation of international order, the attention is on Britain, on the United States, things like Woodrow Wilson and the post-World War I moment, and on liberal internationalism, right? So in a sense, Republican internationalism is a rejoinder or a complement to that, to think about how other states, Latin American states, might have engaged with these same sorts of processes of building international institutions, shaping international law and practices. Our argument, this is with Karsten Andreas Schulz, who's at the University of Cambridge, our argument is that Latin American states become independent in the early 19th century, 1823, you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. This is the same time in which Latin American states are joining the international system. But with the exception of Brazil, they're doing so as republics in a world that is mostly full of dynasties and monarchies. And this, I think, matters quite a lot to how Latin Americans see the world in the 19th century. They define themselves as republics in a world of monarchies. They also are seeking full membership in an international society that often relegates them to a second class, to a lower status. It's also informed by domestic political traditions of republicanism. A lot of these leaders, they engaged deeply with people like Montesquieu, Rousseau, as well as kind of liberals like Bentham. They have a big influence, and there's a domestic tradition of political thought and international political thought in Latin America that usually gets very little attention. So we think that this informed the way Latin American states started to engage with one another and the world. They look to things like popular sovereignty, traditional republican concept, as forming the cornerstone of who really is a member in international society. And if you're a full member, because you have popular sovereignty, the corollary of that is other states don't have a right to intervene. So here we get very early on what becomes a sort of a key point of Latin American diplomacy, non-intervention. Along with that, you also get the idea that they should be able to participate on equal grounds. So universal participation, sort of sovereign equality, are also key Latin American diplomatic traditions. And we trace how these are all linked to this context internationally and informed by these statesmen's kind of domestic republican tradition and view of politics. The argument then is that this also stretches forward. This sets sort of a path for Latin American diplomatic traditions. Things like the way Latin Americans engage with and then use international law going forward from the 19th century. A lot of that has to do with claiming a place for themselves. One, to rule over the states that they inhabit, which have heterogeneous populations, large indigenous populations who are often marginalized from the making of foreign policy in particular, as well as claiming a seat at the table. in what is a Eurocentric international society. And it also shapes the way in which Latin Americans engage with one another, because there's a strong current in republicanism that is about fraternity or solidarity. And so the sort of the impulse to have confederation, to have regionalism, regional integration and cooperation, imperfectly, unevenly, to be sure, but this recurring impulse, I think, is set in this tradition of Republican internationalism.
Regional organizations also have a long tradition and a long history in Latin America, as you just alluded to. And as I was reading through your work, one thing I noticed is that although you mentioned regional organizations, you don't necessarily focus on them in particular. And of course, that prompted the question that I really want to ask you, which is, what is really your view on regional organizations? What is their role in international politics? Do they matter? And perhaps so why has your focus shifted away from them in your work?
Yeah, I guess in some instances I've been really interested in particular regional organizations, and I've done some work on the immediate post-World War II organizations, so sort of the formation of the OAS, the Organization of American States, the Rio Pact, which is not it's a regional pact, but not an organization, and then earlier, the creation of the Pan American Union. But you're right, a lot of the times we've been focused on patterns of diplomacy, or I've been focused on patterns of diplomacy that might happen at regional organizations, but it's not necessarily seen regional organizations as actors. I think the reason for that is that regional organizations haven't necessarily been consistent as actors in the Americas. Some places in the world they do have more what is sometimes referred to as actorness as a region. But I think in the Americas, very often they have been, they've served as kind of a forum. They're a meeting place. They are sort of a focal point. But perhaps because of the dynamics of asymmetry, the particular roles of the United States in the hemisphere and in the kind of the northern part of the Western Hemisphere, and Brazil and South America, regional organizations have often been kind of closely linked to states, and in particular, kind of projects of those two states, and then contestation of other states within the framework of those organizations of kind of the more hegemonic projects of the United States in particular, and sometimes Brazil. So, I think probably part of the reason why my research has, I hope, not given short shrift to regional organizations, because I'm really interested in what happens in them, but not focusing on them as the actor is that, because I think they matter. They shape what states do. They shape how states engage with one another in particular. But only in some particular areas do we see kind of actorness of regional organizations.
These regional organizations in Latin America form what some scholars refer to as an alphabet soup or a spaghetti bowl, and there is over a dozen of them, depending on how you count and define them. And they keep coexisting, and there's no sort of process to centralize regionalism in Latin America. That's been sustained throughout the years, although there are some standalone efforts like CELAC or other efforts as well. But from your perspective, why do these organizations keep coexisting throughout time? Are they successful? Are they failing? Is their existence justified? Is it possible even for Latin America to pursue a centralized process of integration throughout the region, or at least in parts of the region, such as South America or the Caribbean? Is it possible to see a centralization there at perhaps the sub-regional level? And what makes you think this way?
Well, I guess, is it possible? It's possible. But my question would, in a sense, be who's going to lead it and for what interests? Part of the difficulty with economically focused organizations in Latin America, or at least economic incentives for centralizing some of these efforts has been that there's just not that much trade amongst countries in the region still. This is a 2-century-old problem, but it weakens some of the incentive structures to make an effort to try to coalesce these organizations. So what they end up doing is kind of being related to different political projects, sometimes very much associated to certain incumbents, or the overlap of certain incumbents who have more sympathy amongst them. The ones that are longer standing, I think, either are effectively sponsored by a country or two, or they manage to become kind of focal points, default sites of contribution, of contestation or cooperation, but they're where states show up to because states need a place to show up. Interestingly, even while countries for a long time, Latin American countries, were quite tired of the centrality of Washington and having regional organizations like the OAS based in Washington, they also agreed it might be the most convenient place for them to continue to get together. So, the fact that everybody had an ambassador there, and they were often kind of high-ranking officials, well-placed individuals, meant that this was a good place for Latin American states to cooperate with one another too. And so that kind of element of what Thomas Schelling, the famous game theorist, called focalness, shows its face in some of the more successful or at least durable regional organizations. So I think that's part of it. It's kind of, it seems like it would be great to have a coalescence of Latin American regional organizations instead of this spaghetti bowl. But often the different strands of spaghetti trace back to someone. And those actors might have an interest in keeping them alive, or the organization has just enough actorness to maintain itself. There are some entrenched interests in keeping that organization going. There are people who work there, and so they don't want it to fade away entirely.
Speaking of leadership in regional organizations, one key feature of Latin American regionalism has been presidentialism, has been this coordination or communication at the highest level, especially when it comes to pushing regional organizations forward in terms of their development. You've written about the role of presidentialism in the formation of Colombian foreign policy, and many others have even regarded this concept as perhaps something of a model that can help to explain how regional organizations interact. Why is presidentialism such a key element in Latin American politics, and how does it impact the formation of foreign and regional policy as well?
Well, I think it's first and foremost kind of rooted in domestic political structures. Latin American countries have often been strongly presidential. Going back to Bolívar, the independence leader who wanted to have kind of presidents, republics, but with presidents for life, with very strong prerogatives. Congresses and especially courts have had less power in Latin America in general than in other republics, and I would say that's even more so the case when it comes to foreign policy. Foreign policy in republics is very often kind of the prerogative of presidents. But when you have a weak Congress and a Congress with few competencies in foreign policy, everything ends up falling in the hands of the president. The problem with that is, it means you don't have a lot of continuities when presidents change. To some extent, you see this with Brazil, when you have really well-established, strong foreign ministries and bureaucracies, professional bureaucracies and foreign services, you can get a continuation of some regional projects kind of led by the institutional memory that you have in foreign ministries. That's still an executive branch prerogative in presidential systems, but at least it has some degree of continuation when the person at the top changes. So I think it's this sort of it comes back to the model, constitutional models, but it also then links to a long political tradition in Latin America where you go back before transitions to democracy, and you often had military dictatorships, kind of what's referred to as Caudillismo, in the 19th century, and echoes of that beyond, where there was a personalization of power at the very top. And that personalization of power, that person draws some of their authority from their ability to serve as the interlocutor between the domestic and the international. And so if you're in that position, you really try to hold on to the resources, the political support, the prestige that you get from interacting domestic or internationally. And I think we still see some of that. Latin America's predisposition to have summits over and over, summits. What does it do? It gets presidents together, creates this inter-presidential shadow, kind of a reflection of prestige that you get to bask in the prestige of being surrounded by other heads of state, and you hope that has some echoes for your domestic political position as well. There's one thing I wanted to actually add on the previous question, if I may, which is I wanted to sort of try a new theory on you that I haven't written anything about yet, about whether organizations should be understood as successful or not, regional organizations in Latin America. And I think, in a sense, Latin American or Western Hemisphere regional organizations are often viewed as unsuccessful because they all get kind of evaluated by the same criteria. When I think, in fact, regional organizations do, I'm going to simplify it down to two, they have two different characteristics. Some serve as kind of bridging organizations, and some serve as binding organizations. There's a literature on social capital that uses this distinction between bridging and binding, but I think we can just think about what regional organizations do in a similar way. Some serve, like CELAC in Latin America and the Caribbean, really just to bring people together. Right? That's an organization that just tries to create a forum. It doesn't try to actually get them to do much in common other than get together. Maybe have some declarations in response, etc., but mostly it's there as a convening mechanism. CELAC is successful if you evaluate it as a convening mechanism. If you evaluate it as doing things, having projects and carrying them out, then it looks like it's a total failure. It looks just like a shell. But I don't think that's ever actually what the purpose of it was to do. And then you have some that are kind of binding. They actually try to build, maybe amongst smaller groups, deeper levels of cooperation. So the Pacific Alliance, to use one of the more recent examples. If you kind of look at it as bridge building, it actually does the opposite in some ways. Build some bridges amongst those four, but it can be divisive with the rest of the region. If you look at it in terms of binding, well, it has some successes. I think sometimes the enthusiasm there might outstretch the actual gains. If you look at some economic organizations, development organizations, SICA in Central America has done some binding. Right? So I think we can kind of evaluate its success in those terms instead of trying to kind of think about as if there were an overarching organization for Latin America that would do all of these things. If we kind of evaluate it against one set of criteria or another, I think that we might have a bit more favorable, not entirely so, but a bit more favorable reading of regionalism in the Western Hemisphere. When you look at it together, you do have kind of a broad regional system that manages a fair amount of bridging and it manages a fair amount of binding, but in a fragmented way.
Yeah, your theory makes a lot of sense. And actually, that's one of the things that I've been working on recently, trying to create different categories of regional organizations. And well, your categorization is a relatively abstract bridging and binding, but you could even make it more basic and think about economic and non-economic organizations, because with economic integration, there is a material incentive to integrate to a certain extent in terms of your markets, whereas with non-economic organizations, it's basically political or sometimes for some broader purposes like social or environmental, such as in the case of protecting the Amazon. But in any case, there is definitely a lot of merit into creating different categories as to help you evaluate whether an organization is successful. But to what you mentioned before, when it comes to the rationale of political leaders for pushing forward or joining regional organizations effectively to boost their own legitimacy domestically,
Right.
well, from their perspective, it might often seem that an organization is very successful in terms of boosting their prestige.
I think that's
Whereas from the perspective of its member states or as an external observer, it might seem to us like it's not really achieving very much in terms of pushing integration forward. So I think that there is a lot of potential in the sort of direction of creating different categories for regional organizations in Latin America.
One place where I think there often has been a gap is sort of feeling the effects of regional organizations on the ground. You know, if you asked people in most of Latin America who aren't diplomats, who aren't academics, you know, do these regional organizations do anything for you? Do they make any difference to your life? You know, some of it they might make a difference, but it might be out of the scope of what people see or perceive, right? But I think a lot of them, you know, the answer would pretty objectively be no. So I think there's a gap between what's happening in this kind of the diplomatic sphere with international organizations and the extent to which they implement things that are meaningful in people's lives in Latin America. And that's another source of kind of they're not deeply rooted oftentimes in societies and in the region.
Yeah, there's definitely a disconnect between the high-level interpresidential decision-making and what happens on the ground.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure there's a lot of incentive at the top level to actually bring the effects to all of the people across Latin America, because either way, regardless of how they view an organization, the decisions get made at the top. And the purpose of the organization is meant to help the current incumbent political leaders. So that seems to be a gap that's very difficult to close.
Yeah, you would hope that sort of some of the economic organizations, particularly those focused on development, you know, some of them do have a bit more of a grassroots presence, but I think often that sort of the feeling of disconnect persists even there.
Now, let's think about the future, and in particular, the future of your research projects. For our audience who might have found your insights fascinating and want to follow you and are excited about new papers or books that you might be publishing in the near future, what are you currently working on, and what should we expect to see from you in the coming months or years?
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about that. So I've been working for about 4 years now with Karsten Schulz on a project that is culminating in a book called Republican Internationalism about Latin America and the making of international order from about 1860, actually starting with the French invasion of Mexico, up until 1919 and the creation of the League of Nations. So that's a historical project looking at Latin America's international engagement. We have some different articles that will be coming out before the book that look at different aspects of that. Things like Latin America's engagement in the Berlin Colonial Conference, which has not gotten any attention really. Looking at Latin America and the making of the League of Nations. So some of these different moments. I also continue working on issues around small states. So I don't have a paper that I'm writing right now, but I'm involved in different discussions, research networks that look at small states with a more contemporary focus. So small states in the UN, for example, small states in regional organizations is another group that I'm involved in. And so that's something that I hope to come back to. And partially driven by what's happening in the news, I've been engaging still with questions around North America and North American regionalism. So I'd edited two different books, co-edited two different books on North American regionalism, and am engaged in discussions with others who hope to see a more cooperative model of regionalism return or continue in North America.
Finally, let's finish with some recommendations for our audience. There is a vast literature on Latin American regionalism, but it's not always easy to navigate it. And besides, some of the publications may be in English, others in Spanish, others in Portuguese. And from all of the materials that you've explored throughout your career and your research, if you had to make a short list of maybe 3, maybe 4, or just a few sources, they could be books, they could be movies, they could be papers, they could be anything that you find essential to understanding Latin American regionalism. What would these sources be? What would be your suggestions for our audience in terms of best sources or essential sources to explore in terms of Latin American regionalism?
Yeah, it's hard because there is so much out there. Some of it I've got up on the shelves behind me. And so coming up with those off the top of my head is always a bit of a challenge. I think you can look at some of the historical sources that have engaged with sort of some of the roots of this. There's a very good, fairly recent book on Pan-Americanism by Mark Peterson. And one of the things that I found really interesting about this book is that Pan-Americanism has often been seen just as a US-led project. But Mark's book sort of shows why we have Latin American countries engaging. Why do Latin American countries want to be there when they're not being, they're not being coerced always or forced to be there? And he shows how this created a space in which Latin American states could pursue their own interests, some vis-a-vis the United States, but also with one another, to pursue different types of cooperation. So I thought that was a really excellent book. For people who are really new to this and want an overview, there's an excellent article by a historian named Renata Keller, which was, I believe, published in a Brazilian journal called Contexto Internacional, but published in English. So Renata's article gives an overview in 12 pages, where you get a sense of the direction of regionalism from the very early conferences going back to 1826 up until the sort of the emergence of what gets talked about as Bolivarian regionalism. Other fundamental sources, I think work by Diana Tussi and Pierre Rigorozzi that looked at sort of the emergence of a sort of counter-hegemonic regionalism, I think is really important. Is really important work. And then it's important to read the skeptics, and of the skeptics, I think one of the most convincing is Andrés Malamud, who has written a lot of different pieces, but has written some work on interpresidential regionalism, as well as sort of casting some doubts on the recurring enthusiasm for regionalism in the Americas. And just one final piece, which I think serves as background, work by Catherine Sickink, who I think is a tremendously influential IR scholar. But some of the work that she wrote, going back to a 1996 article on reconceptualizing sovereignty in the Americas, really helps us understand how some Latin American understandings of these key concepts like sovereignty and IR have shaped the way that the region pursues regionalism, as well as kind of engagement with the United States and others. So I'll maybe stop with those, though I can send you a long list.
We can include it in the description of the video when we post it on YouTube. Tom, your insights have been fascinating, and I'm sure that our audience will follow you and follow your new research project as well in the future. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you today, and I hope that we can connect again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ivo.